Let's see. Looks like things are running okay. I'm just gonna take a moment to check. Let's say hello to the chat. Looks like currently we don't have any viewers, but that's okay. One of the points of this stream is if I'm gonna be doing some studying or looking at some topic anyways, I might as well share that studying with other people. So even if people aren't available now to take a look at what's happening, then that's okay. It's just like if I were to read a book by myself, I don't care if anybody sees me reading the book or not. I get the value that comes out of reading that book. Of course, if people do come and join, then that's cool, because then we could introduce the interactive aspect of this. So let's see, just some technology upgrades with this stream. I'm using this software called OBS. Let's see, right here, a popular streaming software. One thing I found that could be useful to have is just a little notepad. So for example, if I mention the name of something, some term, some word, how cool would it be if I could just show that word on screen? So there is a way to do that. You could share an application on OSB, which is cool. Oh, yeah, so it looks like you could make different things, what they call scenes, which have different arrangements of sources, something like that. So for this stream, for the first time, I've tried adding this little notepad thing here, which I labeled as stream notes. But yeah, it could be useful to just type stuff that people might want to see. So effectively using technology, that's one of our goals here. Okay, so let's get to the topic of this stream. So a viewer of this stream recommended a book that looks pretty interesting, and that is this book called The Technological Society. So you could just search this book, and as is the case for many older books, you could find it for free online as a PDF. I think it's legal to view and to read, and we're not copying and distributing it or anything. So, just don't get in trouble. Follow the rules you're supposed to follow. But that's to say, if you did want to follow along, acquire and read this text, you should be able to do so for less of a price than a Netflix subscription, for hours and hours of interesting things to see. Okay, so what is this book about? The Technological Society. This book was originally published in French in 1954, and then it was translated in English, translated into English by John Wilkinson in 1964. So I actually have not read this book, but one of the things I wanted to show in this stream is when you pick up a book for the first time, texts don't come out of nowhere. You have to ask, okay, so who was writing this book? What was the purpose for this book? Let's pretend it's some large, huge tome that would have taken a very long time to write. Then other questions also become important, like, okay, so who could actually fund somebody or give somebody the time to produce such a work like this? Let me just contrast this with another sort of source. So, for instance, to make this live stream, it's not very remarkable or expensive that somebody in the year 2021 would go ahead and set up and make a YouTube video. So if somebody makes a YouTube video, does that tell you very much about the person that made it? It really doesn't tell you very much at all. I mean, this is a live stream, so I guess you know that I have a stable enough internet connection such that I'm able to do this. But if, let's just say this wasn't even a live stream, it was just a video, well, you don't even know if that video comes from somebody with an internet connection, right? Somebody with a cell phone could have taken a video of their friend and then uploaded that video, and that friend, might might be living in the woods, being a computer programming hermit in the woods or something. You don't know much information just from the mere fact that there's a video. Now, on the other hand, when we look at stuff like books and known publishers, things like that, then these questions of who published this book and why become more meaningful, because these are not platforms that are as open and easy to use as YouTube. In order to publish a book, you generally have to go through some kind of publisher, and then the publisher might have the publisher will have editorial criteria that determine what sort of stuff they're interested in publishing, and they might ask you to make changes to your work. So they might ask you to use a different title, they might ask you to cut out sections, and so on and so forth. This is editorial control. Oh, another topic maybe we could look in later, not today, but other topics, is this whole thing about publisher versus platform, because this relates directly to this idea that I'm briefly discussing right here. Somewhere like YouTube, you would call it a platform insofar as it lets basically whoever wants to use it for any legal purposes. You wouldn't censor somebody or take someone down just because they say the wrong political thing. Now, whether or not that's the case in practice, that's a different story. But the general idea here is that as a platform, you're exercising less editorial control. Whereas a book going through traditional channels of a publisher, then the publishing house has a reputation at stake. The publishing house wants to make sure first that they maintain a certain quality, caliber of work. They don't want just anybody publishing the works there. But then you could also look at who's funding and directing these publishing companies, and what those people's objectives might be. What is the point of spreading the information that they're spreading? Why do they want people to vote a certain way? Do they want people to adapt certain attitudes, adapt certain lifestyles, and so on and so forth? You could look at what interests a publisher might have in doing that. And a lot of the times, it's explicit. So we could talk about a religious organization. So a religious organization that's a big publisher of books, then it could be, they're pretty transparent about the fact that they're associated with a particular religion. And so the books and the materials and stuff that they published, I think it would be a pretty unsophisticated assumption to say, yeah, I mean, they're in the interest of promoting whatever they say that they're about. A lot of times people just say what they're about. And that is, I think being transparent about that sort of stuff is a good thing. On the other hand, you might have some group and they try to hide behind some very generic sounding words, then stuff starts to sound sketchy. Like, let's pretend I started to make a publishing company and I just called it The Truth Media. Okay, that starts to sound kind of sketchy because it's like, all right, a lot of people claim to have access to the truth. Why? So you're just trying to claim the word the truth and make, the truth publications or whatever. That's kind of, it will take a little bit more investigation, and then people might say, oh, well, this guy who has his publishing house called The Truth, he's just some nobody on the internet, so why should I believe him? And I think that, well, that would be a valid criticism of somebody trying to publish under such a name. Anyways, the point is, when starting to read any sort of book, I think that it is important to look not just at what the text says in isolation, but we want to look at who is writing the book and for what purposes they're writing the book. So let's take a look, before we get into the actual text of this book, The Technological Society by Jacques Ellul. We're going to take a look at his Wikipedia page briefly just to see, okay, so who is this guy and why did he write this PDF is 500 pages. Why did he write a 500-page book about technology and society? So, here's his page. So, let's start. Okay, we got a pronunciation key here. Looks like in English, Ellul will work. In French, Ellul, something like that. We'll just go with Ellul because I'm American. Pardon my French. Okay, so Ellul was a longtime professor of history, and the sociology of institutions on the Faculty of Law and Economic Sciences at the University of Bordeaux. A prolific writer, he authored more than 60 books and 600 articles over his lifetime, many of which discuss propaganda, the impact of technology on society, and the interaction between religion and politics. Okay, so up front we have some useful information about this person that will be significant in thinking about why he says the things he says and where he gets his analysis from. So, this guy was a prolific writer and institutionally connected. So, you could say he's a professional intellectual of sorts and a public intellectual. He's not, guy who wrote in obscurity and his work was discovered after his death. In his lifetime, it seems he was known. And he was successful within the academy. And then this, I think, is important, that he studied the interaction between religion and politics, as well as talking about technology, society, propaganda, and all these other things. So this guy was not totally ignorant, and we'll talk more about this a bit later, but clearly he was not totally ignorant about the machinations of politics and this sort of thing. I think a lot of the times with people that are just getting started in academics or the sciences or something, they might have a very basic or naive view about politics and the history of a lot of stuff. So, for example, in the last election, of course, with the news media and stuff, we had a lot of talk about democracy under attack, all this sort of stuff. But look, you just read into the history of the United States a little bit, go beyond Wikipedia a little bit, though even just reading Wikipedia, you could see our United States has had quite a tumultuous history, and any person who's well versed in political stuff will have lots and lots to say about how the political machinery of democracies, republics, and all this sort of thing work. So, like an example of a quite naive view would be to say, the United States had just a functioning Republican representative democracy system. Everything was going fine since, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln. And then, lo and behold, Orange Man came along and he tried to subvert the order by accusing people of cheating. Okay, you just go and look into the history of the United States and voting and all this sort of stuff. You'll quickly see that there's nothing new under the sun with respect to not only the actions that people have done, but also the sorts of argumentation, rhetoric, propaganda, and techniques that people have tried to use to control public perception and that sort of thing. Anyways, just to come back full circle, that's to say, this guy, Jacques Ellul, he is probably quite well versed in a lot of these topics, being a 20th century man who has researched religion, politics, technology, and related topics. Okay, the second point I want to make about this guy's background. So first off, it looks like he's plugged into the academic institutions, and a prolific writer with some success in his lifetime. So I think that that's noteworthy to say that talking about this guy is not like pulling out some weird fringe esoteric thing and saying that, oh yeah, this guy knows all this stuff, right? Like this person is coming from within what we would call the establishment, and he's saying a lot of stuff. The second point is, right, so this guy was a noted Christian anarchist. So one point that I became awake to as I looked more into the history of the West is that a lot of the times you'll hear, oh, such and such was a Christian, but people mean lots of very, very different things by the term Christian, right? So just to give a couple examples, like you could make a distinction between like Protestants and Roman Catholics and like Eastern Orthodox. All these three different groups, they would call themselves Christian, but they believe quite different things. And they have different sorts of leadership, all sorts of stuff is different about them, but they all will call themselves Christian. So it's kind of a very, say, hand-wavy or not sophisticated critique to say like, okay, there's this person who calls himself a Christian and he was a bad guy, therefore there's nothing to Christianity. That, I think, that doesn't say very much at all, except that you're dismissing somebody based on a label. But how do you understand that label? So there's another term to bring up, which is the so-called word concept fallacy. So another thing to pay attention to when reading through sources like Wikipedia or even fact checkers and debunks in general is to make sure that we do not fall into the word concept fallacy, which is assuming just because the same word is used in, just because the same term is being used, doesn't mean that the people that are writing are referring to the same concept. So this fellow is described as a Christian anarchist. Now, according to a lot of people who would call themselves Christian, to be a Christian anarchist, that is a contradiction. Because if you're a Christian, for instance, there's this phrase, the kingdom of heaven. So a Christian isn't about anarchy, no like a flat structure of society, no institutions, no rulers, to a lot of people that would call themselves Christian, they would say to be a Christian anarchist is kind of a contradiction, because we could look in the Bible and see lots of examples of right-believing kings and queens and other forms of authority in which society is going in a God-pleasing way. Whereas if you look in the scripture for examples of anarchy, will you find it? I don't think so myself. Maybe you could look at what some people that call themselves Christian anarchists have to say. I think like another famous example of a person with that label would be Tolstoy, I think. Anyways, that's just to say, don't look at something like, oh yeah, Christians, they're anti-government, they're inherently anarchical because somebody that called themselves Christian also said he was an anarchist. That's not a very sophisticated way to look at things, and not a correct way either. Okay, so let's look a little bit more at this fellow. So you could look too at how Wikipedia classifies people, and how Wikipedia, okay, one way I look at Wikipedia is kind of the official narrative of history for our time. So you'll notice, for example, if you search a controversial topic on YouTube, in fact, let's do it right now. Okay, I'm going to go on YouTube and I'm going to search for flat earth, okay? So YouTube, let's just say the current establishment doesn't want you to believe the earth is flat. So if I search flat earth, okay, then you could see here. It's a link, it's a little blurred thing that comes from Wikipedia. And I'll just read it. The flat earth model is an archaic conception of the earth's shape as a plane or disk. Many ancient cultures subscribed to a flat earth cosmography, including Greece until the classical period, the Bronze Age, and Iron Age civilizations of the Near East until the Hellenistic period, and China until the 17th century. Okay, so you search a topic, and then YouTube, who presumably is independent of Wikipedia, YouTube is Google, and Wikipedia, wikipedia.org. Wikipedia, their tagline is the free encyclopedia. Wikipedia is hosted by the Wikimedia Foundation, a nonprofit, so on and so forth. So Wikipedia is supposed to be free. Free as in freedom, not as in, well, and also as in free beer. That's another cultural illusion. Free as in freedom. You might also want to look at the, well, I'll add that to the other topics list. Free as in freedom. We'll talk about that a different day. Okay, so to go back to topic on the topic, when we look at Wikipedia, we could see that Wikipedia is kind of like the official establishment narrative of how the world actually is. So I search a topic like flat earth on YouTube, then YouTube automatically says, all right, don't go down this rabbit hole, basically. This is false. And here, look at Wikipedia if you want to find out what is actually the established narrative, what is actually true, according to Wikipedia. So this fellow, Jacques Ellul, he is part of a series on anarchism. So this is to say that in the Wikipedia history of the world, including the history of different ideas and political and philosophical movements and so on and so forth. This fellow is significant in anarchism. Let's see what else. Libertarian socialism. So maybe on face value that might seem like a contradiction, but you could read more about it if you're interested. Alright, some stuff on Jacques Ellul's theology, and then more parts of other series. Oh, I was going to come back here. We'll get back here soon. Green anarchism. So I assume that this is associated with environmentalism of some kind. So anarchy and violence. Alright, so now Wikipedia is just summarizing some of his views on various topics. Right, and then his bibliography. Oh, interesting. Well, let's just look at this really quick. So this is the book we're going to be looking at today. The Technological Society, La Technique ou l'Enjeu du siècle. Okay, but there's some interesting names here. So introduction by Robert K. Merton. This may be his best-known work. Okay, now so Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley is also a known author of the Huxley family. British influential people. Huxley was a pacifist. He grew up interested in philosophical mysticism and universalism, addressing these subjects with works such as The Perennial Philosophy, 1945, which illustrates commonalities between Western and Eastern mysticism, The Doors of Perception, 1954, which interprets his own psychedelic experience with mescaline. In his most famous novel, Brave New World, from 1932, and his later novel, Island, 1962, he presented his vision of dystopia and utopia, respectively. Okay, so in our not yet very deep dive yet, we have found an association between Jacques Ellul and Aldous Huxley, and you could look at who Aldous Huxley is connected with. But this 1954, if we return to our show notes here, this Technological Society book was originally published in 1954, and Huxley was writing at the same time when he published Door of Perception in 1954, the novel Brave New World, more than 20 years before. So just if we're looking at the intellectual climate in which we get someone like Jacques Ellul publishing, we could see that other prominent literary voices include Aldous Huxley, who got really famous with his novel Brave New World. And is there a thing on critical reception of Brave New World? So another, you could ask a historical question, do I think that such and such author would have read or known about a particular book? And is there a reception section? Critical reception. Yeah, we could go. Right, so upon publication, Rebecca West, so is that a literary critic? British author, journalist, literary critic. Okay, so she seems like a known person. Praised Brave New World as the most accomplished novel Huxley has yet written. Joseph Needham. So, another big brain, prominent guy. I encountered this guy. You can see it says History of Chinese Science and Technology. Studying Chinese related topics within academia. I had stumbled upon this guy before. lauded it as Mr. Huxley's remarkable book. And Bertrand Russell also praised it, stating, Mr. Aldous Huxley has shown his usual mastery, skill, and brave new world. So just as a literary work, it seems people were quite receptive of it. Yeah, Bertrand Russell. So you have prominent British intellectual people are interested in reading this. So it's like if prominent people, like the names listed here, are also reading and talking, presumably, about these works, then you could be pretty sure that like Jacques Ellul here would also have at least familiarity with that work. It would be like, you're a movie director, you know what other movies, big movies, come out at the same time as your film. Something like that. Okay. So on this may be his best known work. Aldous Huxley brought the French edition to the attention of an English publisher and thus brought it to English readers. Okay, Theodore Kaczynski, the infamous Unabomber, had a copy in his cabin and said he read it several times. His manifesto and other writings were influenced by it and addressed similar themes. A 2021 study uses Kaczynski's annotated photocopy of the Technological Society to identify the specific ideas that Kaczynski borrowed from Ellul. Okay, so an interesting connection, to say the least. Oh, let me just say, if you do become interested in seeing what the Unabomber had to say, there's a critical edition freely available online, and that would be Xali transcribed this and wrote this. So this is my internet friend I've mentioned on this stream before. Anyways, if you go and you search for his version of it, you could read it all for free, and you could also see Xali's commentary on it. So a Asian American guy in the 90s reading this controversial work, what are his comments that he has to offer on this? So doubly interesting, both because the work itself is an interesting thing to see, plus commentary by a person you could meet and you could talk to. Now, so very interesting. All right, so let's return to taking a look at Mr. Jacques Ellul. It looks like I closed his window. So before tackling this 500-page book, getting started on that, I just wanted to look at one more thing on the Wikipedia, which is what the Wikipedia says about this particular book. So, the Technological Society. Okay, so here we go. What many consider to be Ellul's most important work, the Technological Society, from 1964. So that's the date of the English translated edition that we learned was, just from our short time here together studying this and doing a little deep dive, okay, we found Aldous Huxley read it in French and brought it to the attention of English language readers. So this date that's cited here, the Technological Society, 1964, that is the date of the publication of the English version, which came 10 years after the publication of the French version. Okay. In it, Ellul set forth 7 characteristics of modern technology that make efficiency a necessity. So 7. Rationality, artificiality, automatism of technical choice, self-augmentation, monism, universalism, and autonomy. The rationality of technique enforces logical and mechanical organization through division of labor, the setting of production standards, etc. And it creates an artificial system which, quote, eliminates or subordinates the natural world, end quote. Okay. Regarding technology, instead of it being subservient to humanity, quote, human beings have to adapt to it and accept total change, end quote. Okay, so, alright, talking about technology not as being subservient to humanity in the sense that I have a pen here and I use this pen as a tool. Human beings have to adapt to it and accept total change. So what if instead of me using a pen to be useful to me, then I become subservient to my pen? I have, like, let's just say I'm not allowed to talk, but instead I have to write everything because somebody made a rule that you can't talk in the library, something like that. Kind of contrived example there, but that would be an example of what's being expressed here. As an example, Ellul offered the diminished value of the humanities to a technological society. And the official Wikipedia definition of humanities are academic disciplines that study aspects of human society and culture. So interesting, right? This guy who his claim to fame is writing about technology and society and all of that. So he's actually doing his own kind of humanities work, humanities research, manifestos. I don't know what genre he would put what he's doing into. He's talking about, he's writing humanities type work, talking about the diminished value of humanities to a technological society. So kind of contradictory seeming there, but we'll move on. As people begin to question the value of learning ancient languages and history, they question those things which, on the surface, do little to advance their financial and technical state. Okay, so here we could talk about a term, teleology. When we get to this guy's actual work, I'm sure he'll have things to say about it, but you could say, what is the goal of doing something that you're doing? I think, so we'll visit Wiktionary.com. Teleology. Yeah, the purpose or design of natural occurrences. So I think the Greek word telos refers to some sort of goal. So when people are talking about progress or some sort of progress, progressive, things moving forward in some sense, a question to ask is progression towards what? Like, if things are getting better, then please tell me how you describe what it means to be better, so that I could understand how the tools or the techniques that you use are making the world better. Otherwise, you just say like progressive, progress. If you don't define what progress means, well, then you're saying a lot of word salad. But if you could talk about progress and stuff and then also tell me about what progress means, then, you know, we could look at what you're saying and see what you're trying to do. And we could decide if it's a good thing to do or not. So let's return to the text here on the Wikipedia. All right. So Ellul offers a very strange kind of telos. He's saying diminished value of the humanities with respect to this thing as the goal. Do little to advance their financial and technical state. So, graph go up, GDP growth, world gooder. Is that what he's saying? More, I think we have to look at his work and see what he means by technical state in order to better understand what sort of thing he's going for. But still, it seems kind of strange, Borg-like, and kind of sci-fi-like. By the way, on the preview image for this stream, the picture, it's the image of a guy of the Borg race from Star Trek. Borg Star Trek. It's like a cartoon image of one of these guys. They're semi-robotic alien race that tries to be highly efficient, and I think oftentimes they're characterized as kind of evil villain. Anyways, Borg. So it seems, right, if the humanities do little to advance your financial and technical state, then it's saying, assimilate to the Borg or die. In other words. All right. Fair enough. Well, let's hear what you have to say. So, according to Ellul, this misplaced emphasis is one of the problems with modern education, as it produces a situation in which immense stress is placed on information in our schools. The focus in those schools is to prepare young people to enter the world of information, to be able to work with computers, but knowing only their reasoning, their language, their combinations, and the connections between them. This movement is invading the whole intellectual domain and also that of conscience. I don't exactly understand what that means. We'll read on a little bit. What is at issue here is evaluate the danger of what might happen to our humanity in the present half-century, and distinguishing between what we want to keep and what we are ready to lose, between what we can welcome as legitimate human development and what we should reject with our last ounce of strength as dehumanization. I cannot think that choices of this kind are unimportant. Okay, so what this paragraph, quoting him, sounds like is technological development is changing normal human activities, and he's saying that it's this important issue to sort out what sorts of things we should accept and what sorts of things we could reject, because we don't want the pace and the development of technology and all of that to erase what it means to be human. Okay, so look, I don't think these are any not dumb questions by any means, but when you start to ask these questions, then you got to go back to sort of a positive question. You could say, what does it mean to be human? So that's the fundamental question of a field like anthropology. And I don't mean it like moving out to the jungle and studying primitive societies. I mean, that might be one approach to start to study anthropology. But more generally, like, this comes from the Greek word anthropos, mankind, human, and then ology, logia, the study of the thing. So this question of what does it mean to be human, going into the probably like 17th, 18th century and beyond, anthropology has taken on a much more specific meaning, in that people will think of an anthropologist as, Jane Goodall living with monkeys to figure out how people are like apes or whatever. But if you look at the root of the word, what does anthropology mean? It's the study of what it means to be a human. So this Jacques Ellul fellow brings up that topic. And here, then we'll go back and look at his religious stuff that he has to say a little bit. To the sacred, then, as classically defined, is the object of both hope and fear, both fascination and dread. Once nature was the all-encompassing environment and power upon which human beings were dependent, and life and death, and so was experienced as sacred. The Reformation desacralized the church in the name of the Bible, and the Bible became the sacred book. But since scientism, through Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and higher reason, higher criticism, and liberal theology, have desacralized the scriptures and the sciences, particularly those applied sciences that are amenable to the aims of collective economic production, be it capitalists, socialists, or communists, and have been elevated to the positions of sacred in Western culture. Today, he, meaning Ellul, argues the technological society is generally held sacred. C.F. Saint Steve Jobs, since he defines technique as the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency for a given stage of development in every field of human activity. It is clear that its sociological analysis focuses not on the society of machines as such, but on the society of efficient techniques. So this is to say, you don't want to get bent out of shape talking about robots and AI takeover. Like, that's a part of stuff, but then more important than that is just this idea of techniques in general. Oh, we have somebody stepping in. Hello, George. So we're going through the Wikipedia page of this fellow Jacques Ellul, and we're kind of... The reason we're going into the Wikipedia page is to say, before spending time reading a 500 tome by some dude, if you have a little bit of background or context on who exactly the person that is writing the book is and what they're writing, then you could understand what's going on a lot better. So this fellow, Jacques Ellul, we could see that you could call him a kind of, well, he's definitely a Westerner coming from the French. And in this paragraph, reading about his book, The Technological Society, we could see that he, according to this Wikipedia article, is describing technology and society as a kind of natural progression that has happened after the West losing their religion, basically. So let's just go through the sequence of things before. So he wrote, the Reformation desacralized the church in the name of the Bible. So what this refers to is the Protestants rejecting the Roman Catholic Church, the Protestants saying, why is it that the Pope or whoever has to interpret and tell me what the Bible means? Why can't we have, the printing press, technology, mechanization, right? Spread this over to all sorts of other people, and then we could read these things and determine for ourselves what is the meaning of these texts, and our religion doesn't have to rely on a corrupt institution. So that's what this first line here is talking about, I think. All right. And the Bible became the sacred book. So this is to say authority transferred from the Roman Catholic Church to the Bible. That's how this is describing it. But since then, scientism, through Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and reason, higher criticism, and liberal theology have desacralized the scriptures. All right, so let me just make a couple notes about how this works. So you take the institution, the sort of grounding about where the Bible comes away to say what's important is just this book that I have here. It's not, these people or things like that. It's just this book. All right, then the next step that one could take in doing revolution might be to say, all right, let's look at the Bible just as literature. So that's what this higher criticism and liberal theology about it is. It's to say, like, all right, so our most important thing is this book. Then people might look, all right, so then how do we analyze this text? Just like, I'm doing a type of literary criticism, right? It's like right now, as I'm sort of going through this Wikipedia and saying, like, okay, who is this person? what are they saying, and I'm giving an interpretation of this Wikipedia article. Now, in my view, Wikipedia is not the same as Scripture, the Bible, but you could have people that look and try to analyze something that might have been passed down as sacred text, and they look at it like as if it's a My Little Pony fan fiction that their friend wrote. So this is describing after the Reformation. Then the next step after that was scientism. So this is actually interesting here, because now I think scientism, if you say scientism, you might get flagged by the YouTube algorithms and stuff as being a bad guy. Because I think a lot of people in the public have kind of caught on to this word scientism, especially rejecting recommendations made by our current health and science authorities all over the world. So calling out scientism has become rather taboo these days. But that's to say, we could check when this page was last edited. The point being, they actually say the term scientism here. But since then, scientism, through Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and reason, higher criticism, and liberal theology, have desacralized the scriptures and the sciences, particularly those applied sciences that are amenable to the aims of collective economic production. Okay, so let me just rephrase basically as what I interpret this as saying. When we talk about economic production, meaning capitalist, socialist, communist, the telos, the end goal by which people would argue about these various systems, is a type of material prosperity. So why would you choose to be to identify and say, like, I'm a capitalist, I'm a socialist, I'm a communist, something like that? The sort of war between these economic systems, which people really spelled out, wrote about endlessly and stuff in the West, is that these are different plans in which you can generate more wealth. So this is going to be like a very crude way of laying it out, but you could say capitalists, the main operating principle is free markets, not a lot of government intervention. Socialists will be, you have governments and stuff that use taxation and other means in order to guide a society towards more efficient production. And more efficient meaning you don't just make a lot of stuff, but you could also lead towards certain goals. Like, let's say the markets favor just all sorts of monopolies, and these monopolies just take all their money for themselves. So a socialist might have certain industries that are like nationalized or tax heavily or something, such that what they might call like the excesses of capitalism are checked, though you might still leave in some aspects of free markets. And then the communists, who, well, you could let the communists speak from themselves, but something like the elimination of private property and holding everything in common, and the state withering away, all sorts of stuff like that. So then we go back to what Jacques Ellul is saying. Today, he argues, the technological society is generally held sacred. And the author here, okay, they cite this source of like Steve Jobs being held up as a kind of saint for people that embrace this technological interpretation of the future and progress. Since he defines technique as the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency for a given stage of development in every field of human activity, it is clear that his sociological analysis focuses not on the society of machines as such, but on the society of efficient techniques. Okay, so let me just bring this back to this point that we very briefly touched on, which is it's not about like machines and robots and AI takeover. It's about efficiency and methods and stuff like that. So on the previous stream, this stream that I titled "The Parameterization of Everything," I think that that title embodies one of the sorts of things that people do when they try to make everything more efficient. I mentioned the genre of self-help and business type books. In many ways, you could look at self-help and business type books and see how these things are actually very hard science, in the sense that consulting firms and all these people will arrive at the techniques and develop and refine what they do through actual data collection and quantitative methods. So people might make fun of business and marketing and say like, oh, you guys, you don't do real science because I do physics or whatever. But these business people, they might actually be the most empirical people working in a lot of places, because they do measure and count and quantify and refine their methods to do something like, sell Netflix subscriptions or burritos on demand or whatever you want to talk about it. So I think that Ellul would agree with me that stuff like the development of modern business practices, subscription services, web companies, the quote-unquote business side of all these things would fit under technology, efficient techniques, just like the assembly line too. You could call an efficient technique, though you could be doing an assembly line, making tacos or doing something that you wouldn't think of as high tech. By organizing the labor in a particular way, you're making use of this sort of technique, as you would call it. Really quick, I'll just read a comment here by George. He says, "Scientism flies you to the moon. Religion flies you into buildings." And there's a dab emoji there. Yeah, we'll just leave that comment there. I won't elaborate further. Feel free to leave a comment or say what you have to say about that. Very interesting. Okay. Anyways, let us actually finally get to our text. This stream's been going on for a while, but I'll at least get started with the text just to say we did. But I'll just recap what we did. So I wanted to go and look at the Wikipedia to see what sort of guy this Jacques Ellul is, and I wanted also to show a methodology how it's not good to just say like, oh yeah, slavery is bad, quote by Abraham Lincoln, right? That's very, very surface tier. You want to go and say, what is the context of a quote? What exactly is someone talking about? And you don't want to be subject to just repeating buzzwords. Like a lot of people from this sort of era, and we could look at logical positivism. So there's like a lot of people who are famous as intellectuals or scientists or whatever you might call them, and you might ask somebody, oh, what distinguishes these people? How can we say that what they did is progress as opposed to what previous thinkers were saying? So why are all the ancient Greeks stupid and these 19th century British people smart? Like why is that the case? And a very hand wavy, like throwaway not so serious answer might be like, well, before people were filled with superstition, but now we're logical, we're rational. Okay, so if you actually think a little bit and say like, okay, so what do you mean by rational or logical? One easy way to look at that is to say there's such a thing called deductive reasoning, right? So if it's like let's just give an example of deductive reasoning, we could say we have statement A, George is a man. Statement B, all men are mortal. And then it follows that George is mortal. Okay, so here this is an application of logic in the sense of if you accept statements A and B, then a conclusion naturally follows from that. So that is logic. Now, what is logical about, say, the theory of evolution or something like that? Of course, if you say rational, logical, then when I give an example like this, then it's easy. We could all agree and confirm that this is true because we all affirm deductive reasoning and logic in this respect. Now, crucially, though, to say something like George is mortal or something like that, if we aren't saying that this is something that we presuppose, then it's conditional on us believing these statements A and B being true. But if you rejected like A, like let's just say we aren't sure that George is a man. Maybe George is a asexual lizard snail, right? Something like that. Then would it follow that George is immortal? Well, no, because we know all men are mortal. But if we don't know that George is a man, then it could be that George is an immortal lizard snail man. And what I said, that's logical. It's rational. But you could say that the presuppositions and stuff I gave for that were garbage, trash, nonsense, meaningless, whatever you want to call it. And that would be the reason why you would reject the conclusion that I had said. You wouldn't say, oh yeah, it's because you're being illogical or irrational. Like if you actually wanted to get down and say, right, a lot of the times people that are talking about being rational or logical or whatever, basically they're just saying, do you accept all the premises that I accept? Because if you indeed do accept all the premises and stuff that I accept, then we could see how X, Y, and Z consequences logically follow. Now, where that sort of person is often being proud or arrogant or wrong is they take a whole bunch of things and they accept them as given, and think that other people that don't agree with their conclusions are wrong, yet they do not question whether they themselves are wrong about a lot of the basic premises that they hold up. So we'll have another anti-Fedora tipping stream another day. Let us jump into our text finally. So the Technological Society. All right. Oh, so we get some more interesting information. So at the beginning of the stream, I was talking about how looking at a work, where it comes from, you could see where this work came from, is thanking the Vice President for the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions of the Fund for the Republic Incorporated at Santa Barbara, California. All right, then the guy saying, pardon my French. Okay, then we have a forward. Some statements about just generally looking at trends about how stuff is becoming more mechanized, which is to say Ellul is not just saying stuff. The stuff he's saying maps onto reality. interesting paragraph here. So it looks like in this foreword, they're just summarizing some of the stuff of this book. I'll just go ahead and read these 2 paragraphs, assuming that anybody who is still listening or checking in at this point is interested in what this work has to say. I don't think they'll mind if I read it, so I will read it. In Ellul's conception, then, life is not happy in a civilization dominated by technique. Even the outward show of happiness is bought at the price of total acquiescence. The technological society requires men to be content with what they are required to like. For those who are not content, it provides distractions. Escape into absorption with technically dominated media of popular culture and communication. And the process is a natural one. Every part of a technical civilization responds to the social needs generated by technique itself. Progress then consists in progressive dehumanization, a busy, pointless, and in the end suicidal submission to technique. So, fall into line and conform. Learn to code. Okay. The essential point, according to Ellul, is that technique produces all this without plan. No one wills it or arranges that it be so. Our technical civilization does not result from a Machiavellian scheme. It is a response to the laws of development of technique. In proposing and expanding this thesis, Ellul reopens the great debate over the social, political, economic, and philosophical meaning of technique in the modern age. We need not agree with Ellul to learn from him. He has given us a provocative book in the sense that he has provoked us to re-examine our assumptions and to search out the flaws in his gloomy forecasts. By doing so, he helps us to see beyond the banal assertion that ours has become a mass society, and he leads us to a greater understanding of that society. Cool. So that's just to say, this foreword by Robert K. Merton here is saying that Ellul's book, it's like an analysis, it's unpacking how stuff works, and as such it could be a useful thing to read, because if you just say like everything is getting worse or something like that, then what good does that do you? However, if you kind of understand the mechanics of how things are moving along, the cause and effect relationships that lead things to become a certain way, and you think that that direction is bad, then potentially a good analysis could be useful in showing you the way about how to turn stuff into more useful directions. Cool. Okay, I'm going to skip the translator's introduction because it is time to get into this actual text if we can. Alright. No new comments so far. That's okay. Like I said, I'm more than happy to monologue here, because part of the point of this stream is also to show how a lot of research or going through materials happens. So if me or someone else says they're researching something, what does it actually mean to do research? A lot of the times it is you start one place and then you see the threads that are connected, like checking the citations in the book, and you follow those different sources in order to put together a more cohesive narrative. You want a more complete view of what's going on. So that's what I hope to be doing in this stream. Oh, Xali says hello. Hello to Xa. Xa, I think you missed it, but I showed off your Unabomber website because this author we're talking about here, Jacques Ellul, the Ted Kaczynski read his book multiple times. It looked like he had a photocopied edition. So this guy is going to be talking a lot about technology and society, and yeah, there's a lot of people with things to say about technology and society. Usually, these are not people that are happy-go-lucky people that are just saying, "Oh yeah, technology is great." So, all right. Note to the reader: when does your actual book start? Let's. Oh, okay. Well, it's by the author. All right. We'll look at this because it's by the author. I think the task of the reader will be lightened if at the outset I attempt a definition of technique. All right, so we're going back to this whole thing of word concept fallacy. So Jacques Ellul here wants to make sure that people don't make the word concept fallacy error. So he's going to elaborate on how he uses the word technique, because he's going to probably use it in ways that isn't just like, technique for playing the violin or something. He means something more broad than that. So let's hear what he has to say. The whole first chapter is devoted to making clear what constitutes technique in the present day world, but as a preliminary there must be a simple idea, a definition. The term technique, as I use it, does not mean machines, technology, or this or that procedure for attaining an end. In our technological society, technique is the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency for a given stage of development in every field of human activity. Its characteristics are new. The technique of the present has no common measure with that of the past. This definition is not a theoretical construct. It is arrived at by examining each activity and observing the facts of what modern man calls technique in general, as well as by investigating the different areas in which specialists declare they have a technique. So just as an aside, what I was saying earlier is like, you look at self-help books, business books, right? All these things will describe techniques for some end. So a business book, for instance, might give you a technique for how to do successful marketing or successful like closing a sales, whatever you want to call it. All right. In the course of this work, the word technique will be used with varying emphasis on one or another aspect of this definition. At one point, the emphasis will be on rationality, on another on efficiency or procedure, but the all-over definition will remain the same. Finally, we shall be looking at technique in its sociological aspect. That is, we shall consider the effect of technique on social relationships, political structures, economic phenomena. Technique is not an isolated fact in society, as the term technology would lead us to believe, but it is related to every factor in the life of modern man. It affects social facts as well as others. Thus, technique itself is a sociological phenomenon, and it is in this light that we shall study it. And this was written in 1963. Actually, one thing I'm quite surprised about looking at all this stuff so far is we haven't seen a throwback to the Greek word from which technique comes from, which I'll bring up really quick. Wiktionary, and that would be the word techne. Technis. It's a Greek word, so I might have. Techni. Is that it? Here, we'll start from Google. Oh no, here it is. Okay. So here, this Greek word techni, or here Romanized. I'll zoom in. They've got a whole bunch of definitions here. Craft, skill, or trade. Art, cunning or wile, or means. Now, I think that you look at just the origin of a word, like this is the root of the word for technology, stuff like that. We could see that Jacques Ellul goes on this large, long blurb about how he means something very specific by technique. But then you go back and you look at the etymology of this word to begin with. I would say that this ancient Greek root, it covers a lot of the sense of what I think he'll be talking about. So it's not just technology like, a mechanized loom or whatever, but it includes a craft, a skill, and a trade. So just how people systemize and do things in general. So whatever it might be, like you build ships, you tan hides, you weave baskets, whatever it is. All those production methods would fit in here. But then also too, various things we might describe as arts. So for example, there's this Chinese famous work, The Art of War. We could talk about martial arts, right? So technique is this general term that could be used for all this discovering systematic, efficient methods to do things in general. Maybe we could say in opposition to just naively or ignorantly doing it. Like if I just said, I'm going to teach myself how to drive a car. Okay, well, if I don't follow a teacher and follow known techniques for doing it, then I might end up being a lot less safe and not have as good control and so on and so forth. I might not learn how to drive a car well. So learning the technique to drive a car means being rational in the sense that we want to learn the best methods to do stuff. Okay, so Greek root, techni, perhaps good to know. And let us at least get... Okay, finally, here we are at the text. We want to get just at least a little bit into the actual text of this book. So page 40 out of 503 pages in the PDF. Let us begin reading and commenting on this. No social, human, or spiritual fact is so important as the fact of technique in the modern world. And yet no subject is so little understood. Let us try to set up some guideposts to situate the technical phenomenon. Okay, so let me just pause really quick right here. We open up with quite a provocative and bold statement. And I'm not going to dismiss the statement and say, oh, what a bunch of hogwash over the top. If we look at just this general sense of the word technique, you could say, if you want to succeed in your life in whatever domain you might be trying to do something, then it would be useful to know the technique and to perfect the technique in order to do that. So this doesn't even mean, for example, that you're just trying to eat all the tasty food or make the fastest machine. One could even look at various spiritual practices in the world and say, okay, I want to find, what are the techniques to enlightenment, where I define enlightenment as, having great perception and peace or something like that. We could, and I think Jacques Ellul would agree, that you could look at the word technique and how people have used techniques in order to try to do all sorts of things for all sorts of goals. So to say that nothing is more important as technique in the modern world, I think that we could liberally interpret this statement to mean that, more so than ever as modern people, we're seeing how techniques have become more and more powerful for doing all sorts of stuff. So if you're going to be alive, you might as well learn about what techniques there are, because if you don't learn about and learn techniques to do stuff, then you're just going to get steamrolled over by other people that have superior techniques. Anyways, let us continue. Situating the technical phenomenon. Machines and technique. Whenever we see the word technology or technique, we automatically think of machines. Instead, we commonly think of our world as a world of machines. This notion, which is in fact an error, is found, for example, in the works of Oldham and Pierre Ducasse. It arises from the fact that the machine is the most obvious, massive, and impressive example of technique, and historically the first. What is called the history of technique usually amounts to no more than a history of the machine, This very formulation is an example of the habit of intellectuals of regarding forms of the present as identical with those of the past. Technique certainly began with the machine. It is quite true that all the rest developed out of mechanics. It is quite true also that without the machine the world of technique would not exist. But to explain the situation in this way does not at all legitimize it. It is a mistake to continue with this confusion of terms, the more so because it leads to the idea that because the machine is at the origin and center of the technical problem, one is dealing with the whole problem when one deals with the machine. And that is a greater mistake still. Technique has now become almost completely independent of the machine, which has lagged far behind its offspring. Okay, so just to pause here, this book, like mid 20th century is when it came out. So I think by then, you would have like gasoline motors, some automobiles, all sorts of very advanced machines. Or I think by then they even had radios and stuff. So clearly the machine is a big trending topic, we would say, in the 21st century. It would be a equivalent of a Twitter trending topic. So all this discussion here is like affirming that yes, the machines are a big thing when we're talking about technique. I think, okay, so one question to ask would be like, how is a machine a perfect example of technique? So if we talk about like a function, the inputs, if we talk about the inputs of, let's see, we have a function, and the inputs to this function are human effort, time, and then the outputs are like widgets or whatever, spaghetti, chairs, whatever you want to call it. There's a limit to doing stuff by hand, how much output there could be, widgets, or like digging ditches. So like me, if I practice every day using a shovel and digging ditches, I'm going to reach like a limit of how much output I could produce in terms of, let's just say we're measuring like meters of 3 foot deep ditches I dug or something like that. We could say that machines are king, like machines totally beat humans in that you could get the human effort for this like ditch digging example down to the level that you just have a human driver of a tractor thing and you just put in a little bit of gasoline, and then you could have like crazy huge exponential outputs. So in that sense, you could say how technique is exemplified by machines, because machines have allowed us to amplify the effects of human effort in exponential ways we haven't seen before. Like another example to that would be like text messages or the printing press. Like normally, if I had to deliver a message to somebody in the city over, it might involve me running for like multiple days. It could be a crazy amount of effort. But now with this live stream, right, it's the technology has allowed an amplification of unheard scale. Oh, so Xaw's doing his own research. He found the book Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes, also by Jacques Ellul. Yes, so that's to say, you start to look at various different authors, especially 20th century authors, and you could see what these sorts of topics they're interested in. The Huxley family, like Aldous Huxley and friends, they were also very interested in those topics if you research them further. Okay, let's continue a little bit. It must be emphasized that at present, technique is applied outside industrial life. The growth of its power today has no relation to the growing use of the machine. The balance seems rather to have shifted to the other side. It is the machine which is now entirely dependent upon technique, and the machine represents only a small part of technique. If we were to characterize the relationship between technique and the machine today, we could say not only that the machine is the result of a certain technique, but also that its social and economic applications are made possible by other technical advances. The machine is now not even the most important aspect of the technique, although it is perhaps the most spectacular. The technique has taken over all of man's activities, not just his productive activity. So I'll just give one example of what this sounds like. Like you could talk about truck drivers, okay? So a truck driver, they drive a truck, go from place to place, delivering lots of goods. Most people, they don't think about different trucks all day, but you could look at how the trucking industry, for example, has changed the way in which cities are organized. How has trucking affected and changed human settlement patterns? So the machine, the truck, might not even be the most important aspect of the technique, but rather this whole technique of let us move, lots of mass-produced goods over very long distances. That's an important thing. Cool. Yeah, so Xa was trying to look at what I'm talking about. Yeah, I'm reading this from this book, The Technological Society. And right up here, then I have that listed, so people know that. Okay, from another point of view, however, the machine is deeply symptomatic. It represents the ideal towards which technique strives. The machine is exclusively technique. It is pure technique, one might say, for wherever a technical factor exists, it results almost inevitably in mechanization. Technique transforms everything it touches into a machine. Okay, so going off my own notes here, where I had this idea where it's like we have a function, and then we have this human of input, effort, and time, and then there's some output that you want to get. So if you could define any activity as a function in this regard, then for doing basically anything to just the material world, then you might think of a way in which how a particular machine might help you do it. Like, well, let's pretend you have to cut logs. Well, an axe might be kind of slow, but if you have a chainsaw, then that might make the activity faster, of like cutting down trees or something. Likewise, if you had to use calculations or do bookkeeping by hand, well, it makes sense that a computer, as we have today, spreadsheet software, whatever you're looking at, is the natural solution that has developed in order to better do this activity of bookkeeping, something like that. The machine, so characteristic of the 19th century, made an abrupt entrance into society, which from the political, institutional, and human points of view was not made to receive it, and man has had to put up with it as best as he can. Men now live in conditions that are less than human. Consider the concentration of our great cities, the slums, the lack of space, of air, of time, the gloomy streets, and the sallow lights that confuse night and day. Think of our dehumanized factories, our unsatisfied senses, our working women, our estrangement from nature. Life in such an environment has no meaning. Consider our public transportation, in which man is less important than a parcel. Our hospitals, in which he is only a number. Yet we call this progress. ... And the noise, that monster boring into us at every hour of the night without respite. It is useless to rail against capitalism. Capitalism did not create a world, the machine did. Painstaking studies designed to prove the contrary have proved the obvious beneath tons of print, and if we do not wish to play the demagogue, we must point out the guilty party. The machine is antisocial, says Lewis Mumford. It tends by reason of its progressive character to the most acute forms of human exploitation. The machine took its place in a social milieu that was not made for it. and for that reason created the inhuman society in which we live. Capitalism was therefore only one aspect of the deep disorder of the 19th century. To restore order, it was necessary to question all the bases of that society, its social and political structures, its art, its way of life, its commercial system. Okay, so this is interesting that right up front, he's addressing this issue of capitalism. So I think it's safe to say that Ellul and a lot of his contemporaries, they're sophisticated enough to understand that you can't just talk about like economics isolated from like technology or politics or all these other sorts of things, right? You can't just press a button and say, okay, we're capitalists, now we're communists, right? All sorts of aspects of society are connected to one another, and right, so he's making this critique that to just criticize capitalism as a cause for the ills, that's not a very useful criticism. Continuing, but let the machine have its head, and it topples everything that cannot support its enormous weight. Thus, everything had to be reconsidered in terms of the machine. And that is precisely the role technique plays. In all fields, it made an inventory of what it could use, of everything that could be brought into line with the machine. The machine could not integrate itself into 19th century society. The technique integrated it. Old houses that were not suited to the workers were torn down, and the new world technique required was built in their place. Technique has enough of the mechanical in its nature to enable it to cope with the machine, but it surpasses and transcends the machine because it remains in close contact with the human order. The metal monster could not go on forever torturing mankind. It found in technique a rule as hard and inflexible as itself. Okay, cool. I think that this paragraph, it brings up a very pertinent point that when we talk about modern technology and all this stuff, right, it's not just about like, okay, now we have computers, so, you know, everything is completely transformed. Like, computers are only as powerful as you build systems around them that make use of them. So I could give like a couple examples that I've looked at a little bit. We could talk, for instance, about how computers have been incorporated into all sorts of aspects of society, such as education, right? So now every teacher at a pretty modern school, they'll probably be keeping a grade book on a computer, and they'll have their students using like a lot of computerized assessments, and especially with all the lockdowns and stuff, then they would have remote class and all sorts of things. Now, most of the people involved in using all this technology, they're not like skilled technical operators, so to speak, but they're all being put into a system largely run by computers. So the technique of using computers and standardized tests and all this sort of stuff, it's possible now because we have these machines. But what's more powerful than the computers itself is that you're suddenly shaping a whole social arrangement around the existence of this technology, of these computer systems. It's just like, okay, we have this fancy digital gradebook system. Now we're going to make everybody change their behavior to fit the system. Of course, like, hypothetically, you could just say, no, actually, we're just going to do everything on paper. Like, we have the material resources and everything available that you could do that if you want to. But why don't people? And I think that's where this technique stuff becomes relevant, where it's like the technique is there, and then society and people and everything, they're just converging on using this techniques. So if you're put in a position of authority, you could ask why and ask these questions yourself. But for most people, in a lot of aspects of your life, for example, like I've mentioned on the stream, paying taxes, right? I think you kind of have to file or do a lot of tax stuff online, whether you like it or not, because you have to do banking stuff online. So you're going to at least have to get some documents online. Like that's just how it goes these days. All right, continuing. Technique integrates the machine into society. It constructs the kind of world the machine needs and introduces order where the incoherent banging of machinery heaped up ruins. It clarifies, arranges, and rationalizes. It does in the domain of the abstract what the machine did in the domain of labor. It is efficient and brings efficiency to everything. Moreover, technique is sparing in the use of the machine, which has traditionally been exploited to conceal defects of organization. Machines sanction social inefficiency, says Mumford. Technique, on the other hand, leads to a more rational and less indiscriminate use of machines. It places machines exactly where they ought to be and requires of them just what they ought to do. Okay, so this is funny from like a software developer type of perspective. Let's just say you try to write everything in C code or assembly code, some relatively low-level language. You're not going to get very much done, even if that technique could technically give you the fastest running programs. So what is equally, if not more important, is the technique by which you also labor people and how they make use of the software. So in the world of software engineering, for example, let's go examples in software engineering. There's this idea of project management and also DevOps, developer operations. And right, these are ideas that instead of just focusing on what it means, just the machines, right? We're talking about what does it mean to coordinate people that are working with the machines. Oh, another important idea is like source control. So like the Git software, for example. A lot of the advances that have come out in software it's not like quantum computing or some technique or technology or literal machine that gets faster. Rather, people have been converging on certain patterns, or you could call them techniques, as ways to effectively and efficiently get stuff done with software. So, like, a lot of developers have heard of this thing. A lot of people very much dislike operating under it. It's called like the agile methodology. So this is like a business technique of doing software business that says, all right, you have a software developer team. Now, how do we force software developers to act and do things in such a way that we're sure that software gets produced on a schedulable, regular basis, such that you could satisfy your clients or complete projects for grants or whatever you want to call it. So I think, Jacques Ellul is making some good points here. And in this one field that I'm relatively familiar with, software development, then, using stuff like this, we could see how this idea of technique in Ellul's sense applied. Cool. So some more stuff. This brings us to two contrasting forms of social growth. Henri Guiton says social growth was formerly reflexive or instinctive, that is to say, unconscious. But new circumstances, the machine, now compel us to recognize a kind of social development that is rational, intelligent, and conscious. We may ask ourselves whether this is the beginning not only of the era of a spatially finite world, but also of the era of a conscious world. All-embracing technique is, in fact, the consciousness of the mechanized world. Technique integrates everything. It avoids shock and sensational events. Man is not adapted to the world of steel. Technique adapts him to it. It changes the arrangement of this blind world so that man can be a part of it without colliding with its rough edges, without the anguish of being delivered up to the inhuman. Technique thus provides a model. It specifies attitudes that are valid once and for all. The anxiety aroused in man by the turbulence of the machine is soothed by the consoling hum of a unified society. Okay, so what this sounds like is, with technique stretching into all aspects of people's life, then you have a known method or a known process in which you could do anything. So it's being described as kind of comforting in the sense that no matter what you're trying to do, you always know if you follow a certain process, then it'll get you the result. And it's being described in kind of positive terms of being rational and efficient and stuff here. As an aside, one could look at something like tradition and say how tradition had already offered this, right? Like tradition gives a way in which, say, if two people are going to get married, that this is the process through which they go to get married. You know, if there's a funeral, this is the process in which a funeral happens. So you aren't like unsure or trying to decide on these things. There's already a path laid out to show you how you do those things. So you just do those things, and you don't stress or become anxious unnecessarily about figuring stuff out because the method is known. So here in this passage by Ellul, it looks like he is describing the technical society in a similar way to how one might describe having traditions or having a culture. So we'll continue reading and see if that analysis still lines up, but that's kind of what it sounds like to me at this point. As long as technique was represented exclusively by the machine, it was possible to speak of man and the machine. The machine remained an external object, and man, though significantly influenced by it in his professional, private, and psychic life, remained nonetheless independent. He was in a position to assert himself apart from the machine. He was able to adopt a position with respect to it. But when technique enters into every area of life, including the human, it ceases to be external to man and becomes his very substance. It is no longer face to face with man, but it's integrated with him, and it progressively absorbs him. In this respect, technique is radically different from the machine. The transformation so obvious in modern society is the result of the fact that technique has become autonomous. When I state that technique leads to mechanization, I am not referring to the simple fact of human adaptation to the machine. Of course, such a process of adaptation exists, but it is caused by the action of the machine. What we are concerned with here, however, is a kind of mechanization in itself. If we may ascribe to the machine a superior form of know-how, the mechanization which results from technique is the application of this higher form to all domains hitherto foreign to the machine, which can even say that technique is characteristic of precisely that realm in which the machine itself can play no role. It is a radical error to think of technique and machine as interchangeable. From the very beginning, we must be on guard against this misconception. Science and technique. Almost immediately, we come up against the second problem. It is true that it is another pons asinorum. Alright, let's learn some Latin. Pons asinorum. point at which many learners fail, especially a theory or formula that is difficult to grasp. Okay, so it's used it's used as a technical term with some geometry thing, and then also this more, probably it's this sense, stumbling block, that it's kind of used. So pons is probably point, and then asinotum is probably let's see what it says about the Latin, about what it means. A bridge of asses. Okay, alright, so maybe pons is bridge, and then asinotum is of asses. Alright, bridge of asses. Okay, it is true that is another bridge of asses. One hesitates even to mention it since the question has been so often discussed. The relation between science and technique is a standard subject for graduate theses. In all the trappings of 19th century experimental science, everyone has been taught that technique is an application of science, more particularly science being pure speculation. Technique figures as the point of contact between material reality and the scientific formula, but it also appears as the practical product, the application of the formulas to practical life. Okay, so here it's talking about technique. You could say it's like an applied science. And so I offered a definition of science a stream or two ago, which science, from the Latin word scientia, could be understood as being able to properly see cause and effect relationships. So when we talk about like how is physics science? Well, physics is a science because you could have these equations that very clearly defined cause and effect relationships, such as you could make very accurate predictions about, like, if a thing falls, how much force you need to throw up a block so it goes up an arch and lands there, and so on and so forth. So cause and effect relationship. So what's being called technique here, it emphasizes this practical application of it. That's to say, it's not just seeing and understanding a cause and effect relationship like how one might define science, but it's the doing something, understanding that knowledge. Then what do? How do you apply that knowledge in order to do something? So it seems like this definition of technique has to do with how you apply knowledge that you have in order to effectively act and do something. All right, this traditional view is radically false. So it's saying this between science and technique. Everyone has been taught that technique is an application of science. Okay, so he's saying this is false. It takes into account only a single category of science and only a short period of time. It is true only for the physical sciences and for the 19th century. Okay, so like here, for instance, if we define science in a very narrow sense, so only the physical sciences for the 19th century, then he's saying that's not adequately broad to mean what he's saying is technique. So I give a broader definition for science, which I assume Jacques Ellul might like more, but him talking to his audience is to say that when they hear the word science, they might think of a particular physical sciences for the 19th century. So he's going to continue here. It's not possible, therefore, to base a general study on it, nor as we are attempting to do here, an up-to-date review of the situation. A few simple remarks suffice to destroy our confidence in these views. Historically, technique preceded science. Even primitive man was acquainted with certain techniques. The first techniques of Hellenistic civilization were Oriental. They were not derived from Greek science. Thus, historically speaking, the relationship between science and technique ought to be reversed. Okay, so the general point here, I think, is that technique, is a practical thing that you actually do something in the world. You might actually practically know how to do something before you formulate out and distill that knowledge of science. Like, I'll just give one example. So I've studied linguistics. Obviously, people all around the world could speak their mother language by definition. But not all the languages have people who have standardized down and written the grammar. So you could say everyone knows the technique to speak these languages and to do things with their words. But the science, in terms of making explicit that knowledge in a systematic way that you could study and so on and so forth, that's not done. So I think, technique coming before science in the sense of knowing science being a way to explicitly lay stuff out. And that makes sense. However, technique began to develop and extend itself only after science appeared. To progress, technique had to wait for science. Bertrand Gile had rightly said, in this historical perspective, technique by means of repeated experiments posed the problems, derived general notions and the four primary elements, but it had to wait for solutions which science provided. In the present era, the most causal inspection reveals an entirely different relationship. In every instance, it is clear that the border between technical activity and scientific activity is not at all sharply defined. Right. Okay, so just related to this point right here, technical and scientific activity kind of running into each other. Once again, I'll bring up these business books, these self-help type books. A lot of the times, the people that write these books, they emphasize how, as a practitioner of a particular sort of thing, so let's say you run a business, then you're constantly refining your methods that you'll use in your business in order to respond to the new requirements and stuff that you might have. So you're collecting data and trying to understand things better. You're doing science, and that in turn is informing your technique. And then your technique, might allow you to expand your operations or whatever. And then in turn, you could do more science in the respect of collecting data and getting to understand what's going on more. When we speak of technique in historical science, we mean a certain kind of preparatory work. Textual research, reading, collation, study of monuments, criticism, and exegesis. These represent an ensemble of technical operations which aim first at interpretation and then at historical synthesis, the true work of science. Here again, technique comes first. Even in physics, in certain instances, technique precedes science. The best known example is the steam engine, a pure achievement of experimental genius. The sequence of inventions and improvements of Solomon, de Caus, Christian, Hewins, Deans, Papin, Thomas, Savory, and so on, rest on practical trial and error. The scientific explanation for the various phenomena involved was to come much later, after a lapse of 2 centuries, and even then it was not easy to formulate. There is still no automatic link between science and technique. The relationship is not that simple. There is more and more interaction between them. Today, all scientific research presupposes enormous technical preparation, as, for example, in atomic research, and very often it is some simple technical modification which follows, allowing scientific progress. Yeah, so these points they made about the steam engine, I've heard people talk about America, Thomas Edison inventing aircraft and all this sort of stuff, to talk about how the people that are just doers, who tinker, they make prototypes, not spending a whole bunch of preparation and time ahead coming up with a fancy grand theory, but rather iteratively trying and improving their technique to do something, as how a lot of technological innovation has come through. Actually, I don't know if Saul Lee is still here, but one thing that he has written a lot about is the Unix hacker, the hobbyist. you could look at a field like software development, and you could ask the question, how is it that people develop and find out what works in software development? And one answer will be the people that actually successfully write programs and that know a lot about their systems. They're the ones who are able to actually make progress and go forward. But maybe these people aren't the sharpest business people, or they're not so interested in business. So you might have like a lot of people that develop really great ideas and go far, but they might be in a programming language that no major company uses, something like that. So I think there will be a lot more to say about this stuff as it relates to software. Let me scroll down a little bit to see how much we have left in this chapter. Alright, it looks like we have quite a bit left in this chapter. So this stream has been going for a while, and my voice is getting a bit tired. And I do not think we have very many, if any, viewers on the stream. So I think I will go ahead and close up. But that's to say, if anybody comes and watches this later, has any comments or questions, feel free to drop by and leave your feedback to me. And also, in terms of future things that you might want to go over, things that you're already reading and studying that you might want to talk with other people about, kind of like a academic reading group sort of thing, do let me know. With that being said, I think I will close up the stream. So I thank everybody who did drop by, as well as those viewers who viewed this video when it was not live. And I will now close the stream. Thank you everybody for joining.